There, little pop-up stuff. All right, I'll get started because we should never penalize the prompt. So thank you for joining today. Some time ago, we got a note from our financial management officer for our HRSA Rural Residency Planning and Development Grant at the Primary Care Training Consortium. And as you may know, organizations that receive more than $750,000 a year in federal grant funds must receive a unified audit, which is a more extensive audit than a normal audit that we would typically get if we don't have that much in federal grant funds. And because we don't have that much in federal grant funds over at NMPCTC or at CHI, we got a note from our grantor saying that they would like to conduct a separate sort of desk audit of NMPCTC. And so one of the things that was required is that we have these 18 federal management requirements included in our policies and procedures. And we're making changes right now in the Primary Care Training Consortium to accommodate these. And most of them are just fine in terms of the CHI policies. But I thought, how many of our folks that are actually managing federal money or even managing programs with state funding or other funding, how much do we really know about these sorts of requirements technically? And so I thought maybe it'd be a good idea to just go over them because basically they apply generally as well as just to federal grant funding. Any questions about my brief summary about why we're doing this? You think doing things like this is a good idea?
I think that it's a really good idea. I personally like to see more trainings about fiscal management. I think it's great.
Okay, good. We should always know what we're required to do, shouldn't we? Okay, so I'm just going to go through the 18. I sent you a copy of the attachment we got from the feds that lists these differently. I sort of just excerpted them, put them into this because I thought you could use some orange in your life rather than just a federal table. Everybody needs orange in their life. And for those of you who are moms, happy Mother's Day yesterday. Okay, so these are all things that should be included in our financial policies and procedures. They're not the only things that are in our financial policies and procedures, but these must be included and must be annotated within our policies and procedures when we send our policies and procedures to the federal government for review. And Lucinda or anybody else on the call, please raise your hand or chime in. If I don't see your hand being raised, just interrupt me. That's not a problem. So there's certain ways we have to manage cash when we do a federal grant. Does anybody know how we receive money from a federal grant? How do we get money from the federal government to our organization?
Don't you have to
go ahead.
Drop. Yeah, I was just gonna say drop downs.
We get them through drawdowns. Oops.
Drawdowns.
We get them through drawdowns. And what that means is there's an account set up in the federal government for CHI or PCTC in the payment management system. And they put our grant funds in advance in that account. And we can go in today, draw down funds, and it'll be in our account today or tomorrow. And what are the rules for being able to do that under the PMS system or payment management system? is that we can only draw down an amount limited to what we need to cover our project costs. And we can't do it in advance. We can't say, oh, well, we're going to have to pay salaries in 3 months. I'd feel much better if I got that money in the bank right now. We're not supposed to do that. We know that, the checks get posted on Thursday, and so we need to draw down the money on Monday or Tuesday. But, we have to, it's for immediate use only. And we cannot cover any future expenditures. But it is almost instantaneous as opposed to sending invoices to the Department of Health or asking for money from a foundation source. So our funds go into payment management system under our grant code and under our organizational information. It's an online process. Boom, we draw it down, but only to cover allowable costs of the project. And I'll get into those in a little bit, that term as well. Any questions about cash management? I'm going to try not to be too funny doing this because managing money is not a funny thing. Okay. We need to have annual audits. And again, there's different kinds of audits. And again, if we have more than 750, we have to get this thing called a single audit from the Single Audit Act. It's much more comprehensive than other audits. It used to be called an A133 audit, section A133. So for instance, just to show you the difference, in a normal audit, non-federally required single audit, we have our balance sheets and our financial statements, and the auditor basically says we're doing a good job or not of managing the resources that we have as an organization. We have good processes for accounts payable, accounts receivable, our HR files are intact, and we're done. Under a Single Audit Act, or A133, don't get used to calling it that, I'm sorry, but under this other single audit, we have a much more in-depth audit. And from it, we can analyze things like how much of the resources we spend are on indirect costs versus direct cost, and those kinds of things. We have to select and engage an external audit firm to conduct the annual audit. And they have to be submitted online to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse by 9 months at the end of the fiscal year. Does everybody know our fiscal year? Is everybody off getting breakfast because everybody's cameras are off?
Our
June.
CHI's fiscal year or HRSA?
What's that?
Is it CHI's fiscal year or HRSA's fiscal year?
CHI's fiscal year.
Is it January to December?
Yes, it is.
Yay.
And each one of our grants have a separate fiscal year, which makes budgeting very difficult for the organization as opposed to the program. Financial statements, however, we're working on so that everyone can get printouts of costs relative to their program's fiscal year rather than CHI or PCTC's fiscal year. And I think that's really important to be able to manage well. So we do have to have an annual audit. Accounting system. We have to be able to segregate money between grants, be able to account for those separately. We can't, all the money goes into the same bank account for the most part, depending on the organization. It comes out of the same bank account to pay things, but our internal accounting system must be able to track every single relationship that we have with an outside organization separately. And so we use a BILA to do that. And it's a fine piece of software that does a lot of what you tell it to do without a lot of complication once you get to know it. And I want to thank everybody on the call right now that puts things and takes things out of Abila for being so responsive when we have questions about budgets and expenditures and revenues. Every organization has to have a chart of accounts that specifically addresses expenditure classifications and revenue classifications adequately enough to be able to identify specifically what those costs are for and those revenues, or where those revenues come from and in what form they come as well. So we have a very extensive chart of accounts. Sometimes it's complicated. There's questions about, whether something is a supply or equipment or something. And, our chart of accounts should be fairly clear about where expenses should go. But the system is complicated, although the software, I think, makes it easier. And you can see in the bottom, I'm not going to read every line, but you can see what our software, what is required to be tracked, and understand that all of these things that are on that bottom bullet are in fact tracked by Abila. Is there any question about our accounting system? It also covers more than one company. See, accounting is fun.
Hey, Charlie, I have a quick question.
Sure.
So is
Who's
this,
this?
oh, it's Meg.
Okay.
Hey, so is this, because I know sometimes it's challenging because the fiscal year that CHI uses is different than the fiscal year of like each individual grant. So is it this system that they use to pull like the different quarterly revenue and expenditures that for each grant that they have
Yes.
to compare against, or?
Yes, there's only one accounting system called Abila. It has all the information for transactions of any kind, financial transactions of any kind that goes into it. And it's the sole program we use to extract information about grants, whether it be according to CHI's fiscal year, which is what the board looks at, and you have looked at, but it also prints out based on the parameters that we put in. So if we want to track an October 1 to September 30 grant by fiscal year, we can do that. We take the data often and put it into spreadsheets, so it's manipulable, and you can see it more clearly in a spreadsheet format. And then when you're using spreadsheets, you can see your month-to-month comparisons in one view, rather than looking at a month-to-month financial revenue and expense statement, which is only going to give you 1 month and year to date at a time. So, but all the data that goes into those spreadsheets and financial statements are produced by Abila.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody want to add anything to that? So
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to say, we can filter, so our accounting system, like Charlie says, is all the information that we generate and give you guys report comes directly out of our accounting system. So I always like to say that a financial statement is only as good as the data that is entered into the system, and our system is set up for all the different grant codes. And we can filter our reports in any way you want them, as far as if you wanted to say you're looking at the last 3 months and that's all you want to see, we can filter our report to give you that data. we can filter our report to give you the data, like Charlie said, by grant period. We can filter a report if you only want to see all the revenue that was booked, a specific expense. We have the capability of filtering. It's a really good accounting system. It's one of the best nonprofit accounting systems out there. And we have the capability of filtering a report or information in any way that you want it.
And let me just say that. So there's a lot that goes into the miracle of the information output. So, you know, imagine we have 30 grants and contracts. Each one has to be entered in separately with its own unique start and end date, with its own unique budget for each category and line item category. And they have to be entered that way in order for us to track them. So in order to put out the GL detail or the financial statements or spreadsheets about your grant program expenditures and revenues, there's a lot of front end work that needs to go into it. And it's very complicated given the number of relationships we have with people for revenues and expenses, including contractors and all those kinds of things. But also, you know, before we put the information in, like for salaries, there's every individual's salaries and withholding that has to go in, and everybody's unique contract identifiers. And in order to put a contract in there that we're going to do, we have to make sure that we follow the rules for bidding and contracting and those kinds of things. So, you know, we don't see all of that stuff in the background, but there's a lot of it that goes on. And, you know, how to manage, what was I thinking of? Deferred revenues. Sometimes when, you know, when people provide us money up front, like at the beginning of a grant year, and then we have to book those in the system as a liability. Even though it's cash in the bank, it's booked as a liability. And then as that liability is spent down every month, it relieves that liability. So the liability becomes less as we spend down the money we got in advance. So it's a very complicated system of tracking revenues and expenses. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I just want you to know that there's a system out there supporting your decision-making that's very complicated, but available to help you to make decisions. And we'll talk a little bit about that more in a bit. So how does a balance sheet differ from a revenue and expense statement? You got your revenue and expenses and a balance sheet. So a balance sheet is usually the first thing you see when you look at financial statements. And the balance sheet tells you the status of the organization in a particular moment in time. And usually ours are done reflecting a whole month. And what that means is that in that month, on the 30th or 31st or 28th or 9th of that month, that is the disposition of our organization. You can look and see what the balance of assets versus revenue is on our balance sheet. You can calculate how many days we can stay open if business stopped today based on our balance sheet and how much cash we have, how much accounts receivables we have, and all of our assets and liabilities are on one page. And so the reason that that is done is that if a nonprofit organization, or for-profit for that matter, closed today, what is the value of that organization? And that's important for a nonprofit because a nonprofit can only dispose of its assets in support of its mission. So if we close today, we would have to dispose of our assets to another nonprofit organization to a foundation that does health-related things, there are rules about what you do when you have to dissolve your assets and you close the operations of an organization. And one thing, what can't it do? You can't dispose of your assets to your staff. You can't dispose of your assets to your board. You can't dispose of your assets to any for-profit corporation or business. They must be disposed in a nonprofit way. And that's what a balance sheet tells you. So, and then the other thing is, you send a balance sheet to the bank and say, we want to buy an office for CHI this year instead of renting. And the balance sheet is what the bank will use to see whether or not you're financially viable or not. And they'll look over the preceding 3 to 5 years and they'll see if we've had any negative years, or if having negative balances at the end of the year, having, in other words, liabilities in excess of our assets is a trend or just a one-shot deal. So the balance sheet is just that window, that moment in time, telling us what the status of our organization is, as opposed to a revenue and expense statement, which is obviously integral to the balance sheet, but the revenue and expense statement telling us how we are losing or making money on our products or services in a given month, and comparing to that to what we said we would do in terms of budget, so that we can make assessments on whether or not we should continue a particular product line or service, renew a grant or not. If we're losing money on a grant or a DOH contract every year, do we want to keep doing it? Or is it part of our mission and it's okay to lose money because the organization is doing okay in general? Any question about balance sheet and revenue and expense? By the way, this is everything I know about this, so don't ask me too complicated a question. Okay. I'm really happy when people interact while I'm talking. Feel free. Pretty easy to get
It's a
along.
Monday, Charlie. It's a Monday.
That's true. Just just consider you don't have to do this for the rest of the week.
I know, right?
So disbursements and procurement, that's basically what we do. So anytime we give anybody money, we have to have complete documentation. And I know sometimes that can be onerous to project directors, program directors, managers, staff people, that we always have to, attach a mileage map to our reimbursement for travel. But we have to remember that we're managing public money. In some cases, foundation money, but the foundation money we have compared to the amount of public money we get is minuscule. We're managing public money. And there's, to me, always been a burden of, it's a good burden, but it's a burden of responsibility that we have to make sure that we're expending people's taxpayers' dollars appropriately. So we don't do audits just because we're required. We should do them even if they weren't, because that way we can be assured that we're spending public money appropriately. That's why within organizations, I don't recommend two or three or 4 or 5 person organizations to have their own accounting staff, because it's too close. It doesn't guarantee enough eyes and hands touching things to make sure that we're segregating roles enough for there to reduce fraud in the organization. So having independent financial departments that are adequately staffed, where there's different people invoicing, different people collecting, different people depositing, so that we have a sense of control that way. I'm going to take 2 minutes and tell you a little story of my first days in rural healthcare where when I started working for this Department of Health in Santa Fe in 1982, I spent my first 3 weeks or 4 weeks at El Pueblo Health Services, which is a small National Health Service Corps program in Bernalillo, New Mexico. It's still there. But there was 3 people in the front office, and they were just the nicest people in the world. And I worked with them for those 4 weeks, learning how to, schedule, how to bill for insurance companies, how to maintain medical records, patient flow, equipping exam rooms, all that stuff. And I left there with this great experience and a much greater knowledge of what I'd be going to Santa Fe to try to help develop all over the state. Well, a year later, 2 of the 3 people at the front office were arrested. And the reason they were arrested is they had figured out how to go through older patient medical records and bill insurance companies for services not provided to the patient. And when the check came in for that office visit, they would exchange the check that could be deposited into the clinic's account and take out the cash for themselves. And it was so disheartening. These were 2 young people around 19 or 20 years old who had figured out how to game the system very efficiently and effectively. And the only way they got caught was that somebody came in and audited the medical records billing. In fact, it was press that had audited at the press organization and had called the physician to verify services were delivered. So distribution of responsibilities and segregation of financial management responsibilities is very important. I know a lot of people think when they start nonprofits, well, we'll just get an office person. It's a simple budget. We only have 2 revenue sources and it'll be fine. But I for your future reference, I highly recommend you don't do that. And that if you do that, you externalize your financial management system. Okay, so we have all these policies. We document things that are being bought. We disperse checks and they're approved in large and small amounts. That's why we have purchase requests. That's why we have multiple signatures on them and approvals. We have to have policy to safeguard our blank checks. So we have locking, our bank checks are locked. And the only person with the key is the president of the Armenian Medical Association. Just kidding. But it's a protected system. Any questions about disbursements or procurement? Okay, cost sharing or matching. Fortunately, as far as I know, we have no grants or contracts that require us to earn money separately from that grant or contract. As opposed to like a community health center, like Hidalgo Medical Services, which does not have a specific threshold of how much they have to collect, but they must collect money. And they must report and anticipate budget for how much money they propose to collect during any year in an annual grant application. And of course, they have to report it out in an annual audit. So there's nothing that says, well, you have to come up with 80% of your money through patient billing, but there is a requirement that patients be billed and that be done fairly and equitably, or it's problematic. But we don't have any of those. So that's good news. So you don't have to track our revenue from private non-grant sources. And the other thing you should know here is that you can't match state money with state money, sometimes federal money. You can't match federal money with federal money. So if a grant says you need to come up with 10% match, it's a federal grant, you can't take it from your other federal grant. We have those matching requirements from like an AHEC program. So now we have state funds, and UNM has state university funds that we use to match that program. But we don't have to collect money to do that. Any question about that? Okay, I'm running through now because I'm catching your attitude. It's ready to go. Consultants and contractors. We have to have a good system of making sure that we're contracting with people who are qualified to do the jobs that we ask them to do. That's to be technically, a problem. If the feds look at our contracting system and we haven't gone to bid, it wasn't included in the grant, there's no resume on file, no organizational information on file, and we're contracting with an individual or a group with no justification, that can be deemed as inurement, that we're using public funding to inure to a private individual. So we have to have rules and regulations, and we have to have parties that we exclude from contracting with. Now, oddly, is it the next one? We can contract with people like on our board, but it has to be transparent. There can't be any private transactions, any hidden transactions. If we have a board member or somebody we work with that has a very specific expertise that only they can provide, or a position that only they can do, and the board agrees that that's the case and approves it with a vote and in our records, and there's documentation of the capabilities of that individual to fulfill the terms of their contract, then we can in fact do it. But what would be the limiting factor in that relationship? If we had all the open air transparency things going on with that individual, what couldn't we do? And the answer is, we couldn't pay them more than they would get from anybody else. It has to be what's called fair market value. We can only pay anybody fair market value. Some nonprofits are structured where their boards get a stipend every month. Ours is not. And so if you have a $5 million budget and your board is getting a $50,000 a month stipend, it would be a fairly unreasonable stipend for attending a board meeting, based on the size of that budget. So it has to be a fair market value. So what we do often is we do an annual search on the internet for comparable pay scales. And that's why we do it, because we don't want to inure to anybody. What would a CEO or an executive director of a nonprofit organization with a $5 million a year budget make on the average? What's the high end? What's the low end? What's the range based on experience and education? We have to document those kinds of things. There has to be a basis for making a decision on how much we pay people, even if it's just comparisons with other nonprofits in the community. Because we want to make sure that people are not making 2, 3, 4 times what everybody else in the country is making for the same job, because the IRS can shut us down for that. And that goes out every year. It's a public document called a 990, IRS 990 form. We have to fill those out every year, and they put the higher compensated staff people's salaries on those, and it's public information. And there's other things in the 990 as well. Okay. Expenditure analysis, sort of like what we did before. I won't ask the question. It's important that we resolve high variances on our revenues and expenses by contract. We can't just, assume if we have a trend that our salaries every month are greater than we budgeted. We have to act. We have to change that. In terms of budgets and evaluating variances and those things, are there areas that you think we can do better as directors or organization to help us, be more successful in terms of managing our programs and budgets? Well, nice to be perfect.
No, I think maybe meeting with us, on our budgets, because I feel like sometimes I have questions on my budgets and, trying to figure out, I know we have, indirect costs and things like that, but just meeting with us, I think would be good. I know we've met before, so it's just really having like an amount and things like that, so we know what we're able to use with our program or what we have left, I guess.
And like quarterly or monthly or how often?
I don't know. For me, I think for the most, maybe quarterly would be good. And if I have questions, I can always meet with you soon.
Let me just say that you can ask for a copy of your revenue and expenses by budget year.
Yes.
And, that's good to have. And I'm happy, whenever you want, when we meet, just goes to everybody, to go over those, because I think you're right. Here's the major thing. Our budgets are primarily salaries. 80% of our expenses are salaries and benefits.
Right.
As long as they're entered into the system correctly, and people are getting paid what they're supposed to be getting, there's really not a whole lot of review of that goes on every month, because I'm sure if an employee were underpaid, they'd let us know. And, we have internal controls to make sure they're not going to be overpaid. Our contracts are our next sort of largest category of expenses. Those need to be monitored closely because they're not often a fixed dollar amount every month, and they're done based on work or deliverables that's provided. And we need to make sure that we're not exceeding our contract dollar amounts.
Hey,
Our
Charlie,
supply-
sorry to interrupt you real
Yeah.
quick, but I'm glad that Gina brought that up and you were just talking about it. I'm just 2 weeks back in. I've been off the last 4 months, so I'm trying to catch up. But my intention before I had to take some time off was to start meeting maybe every 6 weeks with all program directors and whatnot, just to touch base and see where we're at as far as grants and contracts go. And I still have the intention to do that, but I'm working on a spreadsheet right now to get all caught up, and then I'll touch base with everybody and probably within the next couple of weeks to try and get something started. So
Awesome.
if that
I
helps,
know.
I'd be happy
I
to do
would
that.
just recommend that we do that together.
Yeah,
so that
absolutely.
we all have the same information.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And if we're talking about, because I'm coming from kind of an environment where I don't know how well the budget tracking on our end, like how well that was kept. And then trying to move forward with it, like trying to figure out where exactly everything is. And like I've requested some different financials from Lucinda and stuff, but just having it like helping from the building blocks, like having each contract budget broken out into an Excel sheet so that it would help me in managing them a little bit better, because this part of my job is where I really feel like I could use some improvement and some more training, like technical assistance. I'm really glad that Marissa brought that up, and hi Marissa, this is my first time seeing you in person. I haven't met you, but I've heard your name before.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I, like everyone else, want to be successful and really know where I am with each contract. I mean, we have 9 different contracts within our department, and I have an idea of our financials, but I really need help in kind of better management skills with those contracts. And I have experience in it, and I know that I can do it. It's just actually having them appropriately broken out into spreadsheets so that I can manage all of them is where I'm at.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
That's
agree.
great.
That makes perfect sense.
I think that'd be really helpful. Like I know right now I'm going to be onboarding some new contractors and just making sure that, you know, what I'm putting in for the budget for them makes sense. And yeah, I think, you know, having kind of consistent meetings just to make sure that we're on the right page. I feel like what is sent, I don't know, I think it's monthly with the breakdowns that we're asked to kind of approve. You know, when I look at it, you know, I look at my staff and I look at my contractors, but that's really just kind of like a small portion of it. I feel like the whole rest of it are things that I really have no idea, you know, what they are or if I should be approving them or not, because, you know, it's like everybody else's salary, it's the cleaning people, it's the insurance business and subscriptions. And so, you know, I just kind of assume all that's in order and I just look at what I know. But it does make me a little uncomfortable because I do feel like I'm approving, you know, a sheet that, you know, at least 70% isn't relative.
Are you approving the cleaning people?
Well, it's every month we get, you know, the breakdown and they say, you know, does this look okay? And it has, you know, every, you know, all the
Like
admin,
everything,
all the finance, all the cleaning, all the subscriptions, all the credit cards, all the, you know, for everybody. And so, you know, beyond what's going on in my particular department, I'm just kind of, you know, just assuming all that's in order.
yeah, I feel the same way, Meg. Sorry,
I do
Lucinda.
too. I do too, because
I'm like,
I
yeah,
don't
I'll
think-
approve this. I'm like, and I've received training by Arlene, but still it's very like, I feel like it's, yeah, I'll approve this, but I'm not too sure about all of these other different purchases that go into it.
right.
Like
And I don't
yeah.
think like we can oppose to it, even if we didn't approve what's already being charged to our account. Do you know
So
what I
for
mean? Like,
yeah, like for instance,
I'm-
like when
I'm
it was
actually, I'm actually confused that you would be approving things that's not under your purview.
Can I say something?
Mm.
They're talking about the GL detail and the indirect allocation that shows on the GL detail. And Charlie, and you and I have had conversations about this before. So
Mm.
we have an indirect allocation that we charge operational overhead, things
Yeah,
the cost
but
has to be shared, but
we've
it's not
talked
like,
we've talked about this because it's confusing to people. The benefits we have are fixed. So when you're looking at GL detail, there's no reason for you to look at benefits. You don't approve the benefits.
well, they're not,
You
they're
know,
also talking
they're
about
part of the
indirect.
organization.
They're
yeah, we're
also
talking about
talking about
indirect.
rent,
Well,
utilities.
and I was going to get to indirect. And also with the indirect is just your share of the allocation of things that are not directly done by your thing. So when we have space, we have 5 programs in the space, they each share the utilities. You don't need to approve that every month. It's just a formula of cost sharing that's in the organization. And so, you know, it's really, if it's confusing or you feel like you're approving something you don't know anything about, it's really not for your approval in terms of those indirect expenses. It's just an allocation formula that happens every month, just like benefits. You know, it's an allocation of benefits based on, you know, what that individual gets every pay period. So it doesn't have to be reviewed and approved every pay period. So I'm happy to do a separate session on that. I would like to try to go through these. And if you would like to talk about that, I think we should, either individually or as a group. But I would like the GL detail that you get to be changed so that it's reflecting those things where you or someone in your department made a decision to spend some money. You know, supplies, travel, I don't know, what contracts, those kinds of things, because those other things you're looking at are beyond your ability to control it as an individual director. In other words, we have $100 in utilities. It's not for approval or disapproval. It's just $100 in utilities. So it just gets divided up based on your percentage, your program's percentage of the total cost of that $100. It's just done by formula. So I think to make your lives easier, you should only be concerned or worried about those things for which you are responsible directly for that expense.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, just a quick, I'm just going to throw this out there. I'm wondering if there is like a simpler way to manage each budget through like QuickBooks or something like that, or if there's room for that in the budget at all.
Well,
We don't,
the system we have manages the budget.
Right, but
QuickBooks,
but if each director, and I'm saying this because I'm concerned about it, and I want to learn more. So I feel like that would be like an easier way in my mind to keep track of each budget. That way we're not manually entering something into a spreadsheet, which is fine too. That's all great.
why
But
why would you
each-
have to ever enter something manually into a spreadsheet other than creating your budget?
Well, if we're looking at projections, if we're managing like how much is left within each budget, if each director is going to be responsible for like, okay, do you have this much money left in this particular contract budget? That's something that needs to be kept up with. So
Well, that's the printout we're talking about.
okay.
The printout we're talking about is giving you a spreadsheet that has your revenue and expense statement, has your budget on it, and it shows you what your balances are.
Okay.
And that's
Yeah, I think that'd
having
be
a separate
helpful.
accounting system to do that would be, duplicative. If we,
Yeah.
if,
Mm.
does that make sense? Because Abila can print out in a spreadsheet what you're asking for.
Yeah, yes, I get it, but I thought that was more of like making sure that we're on the same page with the financial department. I feel a responsibility of keeping track of the financials for each contract that I have on my own. And that's what I thought that we were supposed to be doing, but I require assistance with that, where
I'm
I'm at
happy
right
to-
now.
I'm happy to do that every time we meet, if you want,
Okay,
and support that. And I think Marissa offered to do that as well. But
Absolutely.
the GL detail you get, frankly, is just for you to go through and to see if there's anything on there that you would have approved that you didn't. So if there's $150 in supplies from what's that, Staples, and you didn't do that, somebody needs to know that,
also not
Okay.
just that, Charlie, but also there's for those directors that manage multiple grants and say that a purchase request was submitted and they accidentally coded that transaction to the wrong grant. That's our opportunity to look at the detail and say, oops, wrong grant. Can you please reclass to this grant? Or an expense code was used and they didn't mean to use that expense code, or decide, well, that's really not advertising. Can I please move it to marketing? Things like that. That's the opportunity to kind of look at.
Yeah, so generally correct errors, which is what I was
Yeah,
talking about.
definitely. It's not just.
But I think it would be a lot easier if people only got those line items in the GL detail for which.
We'll work
again,
on
Control.
removing the indirect and just giving them their direct expenses.
And I'm happy to go over in our overall budget how we calculate indirect for your programs.
Yeah, because like for me, I mean, I know it probably came across everybody's too, there was like a sponsorship, NMPJ sponsorship, I think that hit everybody's account. So my question is, as CHI as a whole, if we're all gonna pay for that, it would be nice to know that, because we're in turn adding an additional sponsorship that we necessarily don't have to if we're already doing it as an organization. So, that's kind of my questions on the GL codes too, because I like to know that. That way we know where we can sponsor in placement of that if we're already doing it as an organization.
Yeah, a purchase request ought to handle that too. In other words, if you're asking to purchase a subscription of something we already subscribe to, we should catch that.
Okay.
In other words, we don't want to be sending NRHA 2 memberships.
Right.
But I think it's a lot of burden for you to try to figure that out. Then that's why we have a finance department. it's a lot of burden for you to look at every single thing that's bought at CHI and try to figure out what it was for. You know, I mean, because there are these indirect cost ideas where we share
Right.
costs across
And I
programs.
know like.
And
we
they don't
each
come out
have
as, they don't
indirect
come out as
costs.
line items in your budget. So it's not going to be, they don't come out as a line item in your budget individually. So it's not something you can manage,
So
right?
is there, and this might be the wrong time to ask, and just let me know, Charlie, if you want me to hold off. But for instance, like I have one of my staff that needs like a desk chair. But like the grant that she runs doesn't have any allocations for office equipment or office supplies or anything like that. So is there like departmental funds that I pull from, and is there like a code for that? Or is that something where I would like ask you how that could be
Sure.
funded? Like, how does that work?
Yes. Yes, I mean, if you have no supply line items, it's a supply unless it's over $1,500. Is that right, Lucinda? 1,500?
Yes, yes, that's correct.
So if it's under $1,500, whether it's a computer or a chair or, you know, it's a supply. So if there's no supply line items in your budget, something to consider when you're budgeting is, you know, a little bit of money for things you may need. But yes, if there's absolutely zero funding for something in your department that you can't justify buying, then yes, let's please have a discussion and let's get you what you need.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm, you know, more worried about, you know, capital expenses, which should be over the 1,500, because then we have to depreciate those. There's a whole depreciation schedule. There's an evaluation that needs to be made. We have to make sure we've gone to bids, yada, yada. But for buying a supply, there should be, you know, $300 chair or whatever. There should be adequate resources. Let's just figure out where to get it. All right, am I running out of time so you guys can have lunch? I've only gone halfway through these slides. But I really appreciate the discussion and your, you know, your concerns, and I want to address them.